Villains have always played a crucial role in literature, embodying the antithesis of the protagonist and challenging societal norms, ethics, and morality. From Shakespeare's Iago to modern-day creations like the Joker, villains capture our imagination because they represent the darker aspects of human nature. Understanding the psychology of these characters offers insight into not only their motivations but also the broader human condition. This video explores the psychological dimensions of villains in literature, examining how their motivations, actions, and traits reflect deep-seated human fears, desires, and complexities. The villain archetype in literature serves as a counterbalance to the hero, creating conflict and driving the narrative. Carl Jung's theory of archetypes suggests that villains represent the shadow aspect of the human psyche, the repressed, darker sides that society or the individual does not wish to acknowledge. In stories, villains often embody qualities or traits that are socially or morally unacceptable, such as greed, jealousy, or the lust for power. Their actions often force protagonists to confront these same qualities within themselves or their societies. Villains in literature are shaped by the cultural and historical contexts in which they were created. For instance, villains in medieval literature, such as Grendel from Beowulf, often represented external threats to society, like paganism or barbarism, reflecting the anxieties of the time. In contrast, villains in Victorian literature, like Fagin in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, were often symbolic of the social ills plaguing urban life, such as crime and poverty. The evolution of the villain in literature often mirrors societal fears, with each era producing antagonists that reflect contemporary concerns, whether they be political, moral, or existential. One of the key debates in understanding the psychology of villains is the nature versus nurture argument. Are villains born evil, or are they shaped by their environments? This question has been explored extensively in literature, with different works offering varying perspectives. Some literary villains are portrayed as innately evil, driven by a fundamental malevolence that seems beyond explanation. Characters like Iago in Shakespeare's Othello or Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs exemplify this notion of inherent evil. These characters often lack a clear, rational motive for their actions, making them more terrifying because their evil seems inexplicable. The concept of the born villain suggests that some individuals possess an inherent capacity for evil, perhaps due to a psychological disorder or a deeply flawed personality. On the other hand, many literary works suggest that villains are made, not born. This perspective emphasizes the role of environment, upbringing, and social factors in shaping an individual's path towards villainy. For instance, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein explores how societal rejection and lack of empathy can turn a creature into a monster. Similarly, the character of Heathcliff in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is driven to cruelty and vengeance by the harsh treatment and social injustice he experiences as a child. These narratives suggest that villains are often the products of a society that fails them, highlighting the potential for redemption if circumstances had been different. Villains in literature are often complex characters with multifaceted personalities. They are not simply embodiments of evil. Rather, they possess depth and intricacy that make them compelling and, at times, even sympathetic. This complexity is key to understanding their psychology. Many literary villains embody a duality that makes them intriguing. They often display traits that are seemingly contradictory: kindness and cruelty, love and hate, intelligence and madness. This duality can be seen in characters like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, who literally embodies the split between good and evil within a single person. Similarly, the character of Macbeth in Shakespeare's play is both a brave soldier and a ruthless murderer, driven by ambition and manipulated by external forces. The duality of these characters reflects the idea that good and evil coexist within all individuals, and that circumstances can tip the balance one way or the other. A key aspect of the psychology of villains is their ability to justify their actions. Unlike heroes, who often struggle with moral dilemmas, villains typically possess a clear sense of purpose and rationale for their behavior. This justification often stems from a perceived sense of injustice, a desire for power, or a belief that their actions are necessary for a greater good. For instance, Thanos in the Avengers series believes that his plan to eradicate half of the universe's population is a necessary evil to save it from overpopulation. This sense of purpose and justification makes villains particularly dangerous because they believe in the righteousness of their cause. Trauma is often a significant factor in the development of villainous traits. Many villains in literature have experienced some form of trauma, be it physical, emotional, or psychological, that contributes to their descent into evil. For example, the character of Eric in Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera is shaped by the rejection and cruelty he experiences due to his physical deformity. This trauma leads him to embrace his role as a villain, using his genius and cruelty to exact revenge on those who wronged him. The presence of trauma in a villain's backstory often adds a layer of sympathy to their character, blurring the line between victim and perpetrator. Villains in literature often serve as mirrors to the societies in which they exist, reflecting cultural anxieties, moral dilemmas, and social injustices. They challenge the status quo, forcing both characters and readers to confront uncomfortable truths about the world they live in. In many works of literature, villains function as critics of society, pointing out its flaws and hypocrisies. For example, in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the character of Raskolnikov challenges the moral and ethical foundations of society by committing murder and then justifying it through a twisted sense of logic. Similarly, the character of Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust acts as a tempter and critic, exposing the vanity and corruption of human desires. These villains force readers to question the moral fabric of society and the true nature of justice and righteousness. Villains often drive the narrative by pushing protagonists and, by extension, society toward growth and change. The challenges they present force heroes to confront their own shortcomings and to evolve. For example, the Joker in the Batman series challenges Batman's moral code, pushing him to question the limits of his own justice. Similarly, in George Orwell's 1984, the character of O'Brien serves as a villain who forces the protagonist, Winston Smith, to confront the terrifying power of totalitarianism. These villains, through their actions and ideologies, act as catalysts for change, even if that change comes at a great cost. The portrayal of villains has evolved significantly over time, reflecting changing societal values and psychological understanding. In contemporary literature, villains are often portrayed with greater psychological depth and moral ambiguity than their predecessors. In modern literature, there has been a shift towards creating villains who are more sympathetic and relatable. These villains often possess qualities that make them human, such as vulnerability, self-doubt, or a tragic past. Characters like Severus Snape in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series or Killmonger in the film Black Panther exemplify this trend. These villains are not purely evil. They're complex individuals whose motivations are rooted in personal pain, loss, or a desire for justice. This evolution reflects a growing recognition of the complexity of human nature and the idea that good and evil are not always clear-cut categories. Alongside the sympathetic villain, modern literature has also seen the rise of the anti-villain, a character who possesses villainous traits but whose actions are driven by a noble or relatable goal. For example, in the TV series Breaking Bad, Walter White becomes a drug lord to provide for his family after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. While his actions are morally reprehensible, his initial motivation is sympathetic, blurring the line between hero and villain. The anti-villain challenges traditional notions of morality, suggesting that the ends may sometimes justify the means, even if those means are morally dubious. The rise of the psychological thriller genre has also led to a focus on the villain as the protagonist. In these narratives, the story is told from the perspective of the villain, offering deep insight into their psyche and motivations. Patricia Highsmith's The Talented Mr. Ripley and Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl are examples of this trend, where the villain's perspective dominates the narrative, making readers complicit in their schemes. These works challenge readers to empathize with characters who are morally flawed, raising questions about the nature of evil and the extent to which it can be understood or even forgiven. Literature uses villains to explore various aspects of human psychology, including the nature of evil, the complexity of the human mind, and the moral dilemmas that individuals face. Villains in literature often serve as embodiments of evil, allowing authors to explore its nature and origins. Through these characters, literature can delve into questions about whether evil is an external force that corrupts, or an internal darkness inherent in all humans. For example, in Lord of the Flies by William Golding, the character of Jack represents the primal, savage instincts that emerge when societal structures break down, suggesting that evil resides within us all, waiting to be unleashed under the right conditions. Similarly, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness * uses the character of Kurtz to explore the idea that evil can stem from the abandonment of societal norms and the surrender to one's basest desires. These narratives invite readers to consider whether evil is an inherent part of human nature or a consequence of external influences. Villains often serve as vehicles for exploring moral ambiguity and ethical dilemmas. By challenging the protagonists and the reader's sense of right and wrong, villains push the boundaries of conventional morality. In Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov's internal struggle to explore the consequences of believing oneself above the law, questioning whether the end can ever justify the means. Similarly, the character of Tom Ripley in The Talented Mr. Ripley engages in morally reprehensible actions, yet his charm and intelligence make him a fascinating, if deeply flawed, character. These stories blur the lines between good and evil, forcing readers to confront the complexities of human morality and the often uncomfortable reality that right and wrong are not always clear-cut. The exploration of the unconscious mind is another key psychological dimension of villains in literature. Sigmund Freud's theories of the id, ego, and superego have influenced the portrayal of villains as characters who give in to their most primal desires at the expense of their moral compass. For example, in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde represents the unchecked id, manifesting as a figure of pure, unrestrained evil that Dr. Jekyll cannot control. This duality reflects the tension between the conscious and unconscious mind, suggesting that even the most upright individuals possess a hidden darkness that can emerge under certain circumstances. Villains often personify this darkness, allowing literature to explore the psychological conflict between societal expectations and primal instincts. As literature has evolved, so too has the depiction of villains in modern media and pop culture. Villains in films, television shows, and graphic novels often build on literary traditions while also reflecting contemporary societal concerns. One of the most notable trends in modern media is the rise of the charismatic villain, a character who, despite their evil deeds, captivates the audience with their charm, wit, and complexity. Characters like Loki from the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Joker from The Dark Knight are prime examples of this archetype. These villains are often more intriguing than the heroes themselves, as their charisma and depth make them compelling figures who challenge the audience's perceptions of good and evil. The appeal of the charismatic villain lies in their ability to articulate their worldview in a way that, while morally questionable, is intellectually engaging and emotionally resonant. In contemporary media, there is also a growing trend towards creating villains who are relatable characters whose motivations are understandable and whose actions, while extreme, stem from a place of pain, loss, or injustice. For example, Killmonger in Black Panther is a villain whose desire to overthrow oppressive systems and empower marginalized communities resonates with real-world issues of social justice. Similarly, in Breaking Bad, Walter White's transformation from a mild-mannered teacher to a ruthless drug lord is driven by his desperation to provide for his family, making him a villain that audiences can empathize with, even as they condemn his actions. These relatable villains reflect a shift in storytelling that emphasizes the complexity of human motivation and the idea that even those who commit evil acts may do so for reasons that, in another context, might be considered noble. The lines between villains and anti-heroes have become increasingly blurred in modern storytelling. Anti-heroes are protagonists who possess qualities traditionally associated with villains such as ruthlessness, moral ambiguity, or a willingness to break the rules to achieve the goals. Characters like Tony Soprano in The Sopranos or Dexter Morgan in Dexter are anti-heroes whose actions often straddle the line between heroism and villainy. These characters challenge traditional notions of morality by placing the audience in the position of rooting for individuals who commit morally dubious acts. The rise of the anti-hero reflects a broader cultural shift towards exploring the gray areas of human behavior, acknowledging that people are often a mix of both good and bad qualities. Psychological theories continue to play a significant role in the depiction of villains in modern media. Concepts from psychoanalysis, such as repression, the Oedipus complex, and the death drive, are frequently explored in the characterization of villains. For instance, the character of Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho embodies the Oedipus complex, with his murderous tendencies stemming from a pathological attachment to his mother. Similarly, the Joker in various adaptations is often portrayed as embodying the death drive, a desire for chaos and destruction that defies rational explanation. These psychological theories provide a framework for understanding the motivations of villains, offering deeper insight into their actions and the dark aspects of human nature they represent. The enduring appeal of villains in literature and media can be attributed to their ability to embody the complexities of human nature, challenge societal norms, and evoke a range of emotions in the audience. Villains fascinate us because they allow us to explore the darker sides of the human experience in a way that is both safe and compelling. One reason villains are so compelling is that they serve as agents of catharsis, allowing readers and viewers to experience and confront their own darker impulses vicariously. By identifying with or reacting to a villain's actions, the audience can engage with feelings of anger, jealousy, or hatred that they might otherwise repress. This cathartic experience can be both thrilling and unsettling, as it forces individuals to recognize the potential for evil within themselves. Literature and media provide a safe space for this exploration, allowing people to confront and process these emotions without real-world consequences. Villains often symbolize rebellion against societal norms and conventions, making them appealing figures for audiences who feel constrained by those same norms. Characters like Tyler Durden in Fight Club or V in V for Vendetta embody the desire to overthrow corrupt or oppressive systems, resonating with readers who feel disenfranchised or disillusioned with the status quo. These villains represent a form of liberation, albeit one that comes at a great cost. Their appeal lies in their willingness to challenge authority and question the values that society takes for granted, even if their methods are extreme or destructive. The moral complexity of villains is another factor that contributes to their enduring appeal. Unlike traditional heroes, who are often bound by strict moral codes, villains operate in a space of moral ambiguity, making choices that are driven by personal desires, flawed logic, or a rejection of societal norms. This complexity makes them more relatable and human, as it reflects the reality that individuals are not always purely good or evil, but rather a mix of both. The moral ambiguity of villains forces audiences to grapple with difficult questions about justice, morality, and the nature of evil, making their stories more intellectually and emotionally engaging. In the digital age, the portrayal of villains has continued to evolve, influenced by new technologies, social media, and changing cultural dynamics. Villains in modern narratives often reflect contemporary concerns such as cybersecurity, terrorism, and the impact of social media on identity and behavior. Characters like Elliot Alderson in Mr. Robot or the members of the hacker group of society embody the anxieties of the digital age, using technology to challenge powerful institutions and expose societal hypocrisies. These modern villains are not only products of their time but also challenge audiences to consider the ethical implications of living in a digitally connected world. Villains often serve as critical tests for the protagonist's moral development. They force heroes to confront their own values and question the limits of their morality. For example, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the character of Ivan Karamazov is not a villain in the traditional sense but plays the role of a philosophical antagonist, challenging his brother Alyosha's faith and ideals. Ivan's existential questioning about the existence of evil and suffering tests the protagonist's moral beliefs, leading to a deeper exploration of faith, doubt, and the nature of good and evil. Villains like Ivan do not simply oppose the hero physically but engage them in a battle of ideologies, forcing them to grow and evolve. Building on Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, villains can be seen as external representations of the hero's internal struggles. The shadow comprises the parts of the self that the individual denies or represses, often containing traits like anger, jealousy, or the desire for power. By confronting villains, heroes are symbolically facing their own shadow, acknowledging and integrating these darker aspects of themselves. In Star Wars, for example, Luke Skywalker's confrontation with Darth Vader is not just a physical battle but also a psychological one, where Luke must confront the potential for darkness within himself. This confrontation with the shadow is a crucial part of the hero's journey, as it leads to a more complete and balanced self. The portrayal of female villains often carries unique psychological and societal implications. The femme fatale archetype, seen in characters like Lady Macbeth in Macbeth or Cathy Ames in John Steinbeck's East of Eden, represents a woman who uses her sexuality, intelligence, and ruthlessness to manipulate others, often leading to their downfall. This archetype is deeply rooted in patriarchal anxieties about female power and sexuality, reflecting societal fears about women who defy traditional gender roles. The femme fatale is a complex figure who embodies both attraction and danger, challenging the notion of women as inherently nurturing or passive. The figure of the witch in literature also carries significant psychological and cultural weight. Witches, like the character of the Wicked Witch of the West in L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz or the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth, often represent transgressive female power and the fear of the unknown. Historically, the witch has been a symbol of societal anxieties about women who defy patriarchal norms, embodying fears of female independence, sexuality, and knowledge. The witch as a villain challenges the boundaries between good and evil, often operating in a liminal space where traditional moral categories break down. Understanding the psychology of villains can evoke empathy in readers, even for those who commit heinous acts. This empathetic response is often driven by a deep exploration of the villain's backstory, motivations, and psychological state. For example, in Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, the character of Javert, though antagonistic, garners empathy due to his rigid moral code and internal struggle with his own beliefs. The psychological depth given to such characters allows readers to see them as more than just embodiments of evil. They are individuals shaped by their experiences, beliefs, and circumstances. This complexity invites readers to question their own moral judgments and to recognize the humanity in those who are often labeled as villains. Villains also play a crucial role in the cathartic experience of literature. Aristotle's concept of catharsis involves the emotional release that comes from experiencing fear and pity through drama. Villains often elicit these emotions, providing readers with a vicarious experience of the darker aspects of life. Through the defeat or redemption of the villain, readers can experience a sense of moral resolution and emotional release. This cathartic process is psychologically beneficial, allowing readers to confront and process their own fears and anxieties in a controlled environment. Many modern literary works and films challenge the traditional binary of good versus evil by presenting the villain's perspective in a way that promotes ethical relativism. This approach suggests that morality is not absolute but relative to individual circumstances, culture, or perspective. In Game of Thrones, for instance, characters like Cersei Lannister are portrayed with a mix of villainous and sympathetic qualities, prompting viewers to consider the context of her actions, such as her need to protect her family. Ethical relativism in villain portrayals challenges readers to question whether there is an objective morality or whether right and wrong are constructs shaped by individual and cultural factors. Another aspect of ethical relativism in literature is the treatment of justice as a relative concept. Villains often have their own sense of justice that conflicts with societal norms. For example, in Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the character of Claude Frollo believes his actions are justified by his religious zeal, even as they lead to tragic consequences. This conflict between individual and societal notions of justice highlights the complexity of moral decision-making and the difficulty of defining what is truly just. Villains often embody this tension, forcing readers to confront the ambiguities of justice and the challenges of creating a fair society. Postmodern literature often deconstructs the traditional roles of heroes and villains, blurring the lines between the two. In works like Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, the protagonist Humbert Humbert is both the narrator and the villain, challenging readers to grapple with the moral ambiguity of his actions. This deconstruction reflects a postmodern skepticism towards grand narratives and absolute truths, suggesting that good and evil are subjective constructs rather than universal categories. Postmodern villains often lack clear motivations or justifications, reflecting the chaotic and fragmented nature of reality as perceived in postmodern thought. Postmodern literature also explores the idea of the fragmented self, where the villain is not a coherent, unified character but a collection of conflicting identities and desires. This fragmentation reflects the postmodern view of identity as fluid and unstable, challenging the notion of a consistent, singular self. In Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho, the character of Patrick Bateman embodies this fragmentation, as his violent, sociopathic tendencies coexist with a superficial, consumerist identity. The fragmented nature of such villains challenges traditional psychological models of the self, suggesting that identity is a complex, multifaceted construct shaped by external forces and internal contradictions. Literature often uses villains to explore existential questions about meaning, freedom, and the nature of existence. Existential villains, such as those found in the works of Jean-Paul Sartre or Albert Camus, embody the struggle with meaninglessness and the burden of freedom. For example, Meursault in Camus' The Stranger is not a villain in the traditional sense but becomes an antagonist to society due to his rejection of conventional morality and his indifference to life's meaning. Such characters reflect the existential view that life is inherently absurd and that individuals must create their own meaning, even if it leads them into conflict with societal norms. Nihilism, the belief that life is without inherent meaning or value, is a common trait among literary villains, particularly in modern and postmodern literature. Nihilistic villains often act out of a belief that nothing matters, leading to destructive or chaotic behavior. The Joker in The Dark Knight is a quintessential example of a nihilistic villain, as he seeks to undermine societal order purely to demonstrate the futility of human attempts at control and meaning. Such characters challenge the reader to confront the possibility that life may be inherently meaningless and that human efforts to impose order are ultimately futile. In Joseph Campbell's Monmouth, or The Hero's Journey, the villain plays a crucial role as the antagonist who challenges the hero and catalyzes their transformation. The villain often represents the hero's greatest fears or weaknesses, which must be overcome for the hero to achieve self-realization and return transformed. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, Sauron represents the ultimate evil that Frodo must confront, symbolizing the internal and external battles that define the hero's journey. Without the villain, the hero's journey would lack the conflict necessary for growth, making the villain an essential component of this narrative structure. The hero's return, a key stage in the hero's journey, is often defined by the defeat of the villain. However, this defeat is not always physical. It can also represent the hero's overcoming of their own internal struggles. The defeat of the villain often symbolizes the hero's mastery over the forces that once threatened to destroy them, marking the completion of their transformation. In Harry Potter, Voldemort's defeat signifies not only the end of the external conflict but also Harry's acceptance of his role as a leader and protector, having overcome his own doubts and fears. The villain's defeat is thus central to the hero's return, symbolizing the restoration of order and the hero's newfound wisdom. Villains in literature often act as mirrors, reflecting the darker aspects of the reader's own psyche. When we encounter a villain who embodies certain fears, desires, or moral failings, it forces us to confront these aspects within ourselves. This mirroring effect can be unsettling because it challenges the reader to acknowledge that the potential for evil exists within everyone. For example, in The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, the character of Dorian Gray becomes a reflection of the reader's own vanity and fear of aging. As Dorian descends into moral decay, readers are forced to consider their own values and the lengths they might go to preserve their youth or indulge in the desires. In some cases, readers may find themselves identifying with villains, especially when these characters are portrayed with a depth of psychological realism. This identification can occur when the villain's motivations or background resonate with the reader's personal experiences or emotions. For instance, Shakespeare's Macbeth evokes a complex response from audiences who may sympathize with Macbeth's ambition and his subsequent descent into madness. His tragic flaw, unchecked ambition, resonates with a universal human experience, making him a villain whose inner turmoil and regret are relatable. This identification complicates the moral clarity of the narrative, creating a more nuanced emotional engagement with the text. Many villains undergo a significant psychological transformation over the course of a narrative, often beginning as innocent or morally ambiguous characters who are gradually corrupted by the desires, circumstances, or environment. This arc from innocence to corruption provides insight into how external and internal factors can drive an individual towards villainy. In Breaking Bad, Walter White's transformation from a struggling chemistry teacher to a ruthless drug lord is a gradual process, driven by his desperation, pride, and the increasingly dangerous situations he faces. This type of villainous arc underscores the idea that anyone can become a villain under the right, or wrong, conditions, challenging the notion of inherent evil. Trauma is often a pivotal factor in the psychological development of villains. Many literary villains have backstories that include significant trauma such as abuse, loss, or betrayal that shapes their worldview and motivates their actions. This trauma often manifests as a deep sense of injustice or a desire for revenge, leading them down a path of destruction. For example, in Magneto from the X-Men comics and films, his experiences as a Holocaust survivor fuel his extreme measures to protect Mutantkind, reflecting the long-lasting impact of trauma on an individual's psyche. Exploring the role of trauma in the making of villains not only adds depth to these characters but also encourages readers to consider the broader social and psychological factors that contribute to destructive behavior. Villains in literature are often shaped by the cultural and historical contexts in which they were created, reflecting the anxieties, values, and conflicts of their time. For example, the portrayal of vampires in literature, from Bram Stoker's Dracula to Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, reflects changing societal attitudes towards sexuality, disease, and otherness. Stoker's Dracula can be seen as a product of Victorian fears about immigration, sexuality, and the spread of disease, while Rice's vampires embody more modern concerns about existentialism, loneliness, and the search for identity. By examining the cultural and historical contexts of villains, we can gain a deeper understanding of how these characters resonate with contemporary audiences and reflect the values and fears of their time. Villains are often used as allegorical figures, representing broader political or social issues. In George Orwell's 1984, the character of Big Brother serves as an allegory for totalitarian regimes, representing the dangers of absolute power and surveillance. Similarly, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the creature can be interpreted as a symbol of the marginalized and oppressed, exploring themes of social injustice and the consequences of scientific hubris. Villains as allegorical figures allow authors to critique society and politics, using these characters to embody and explore complex social issues in a way that is accessible and engaging for readers. Gothic literature, with its focus on the supernatural, the uncanny, and the exploration of the darker aspects of human nature, has produced some of the most iconic villains in literary history. Characters like Dracula, Mr. Hyde, and the various haunted or monstrous figures in the works of Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft exemplify the Gothic villain. These characters often symbolize repressed desires, societal taboos, or the fear of the unknown. The Gothic villain is typically shrouded in mystery and often blurs the line between human and monster, reflecting the genre's preoccupation with the ambiguity of evil and the duality of human nature. In science fiction, villains often embody fears about technology, the future, and the unknown. These villains are frequently depicted as artificial intelligences, aliens, or scientists whose experiments have gone awry, representing the dangers of unchecked scientific progress or the hubris of humanity. For instance, HAL 9000 in 2001, A Space Odyssey represents the fear of losing control over the very technology humans create, while the various alien antagonists in works like War of the Worlds reflect anxieties about invasion and the unknown. Science fiction villains often challenge the ethical implications of technological advancement, questioning whether humanity is prepared to handle the consequences of its own creations. Fantasy literature often features villains who embody archetypal forces of evil, such as dark lords, corrupt sorcerers, or malevolent gods. These villains are often larger-than-life figures who represent fundamental conflicts between good and evil. Characters like Sauron in The Lord of the Rings or the White Witch in the Chronicles of Narnia serve as embodiments of pure evil, against which the heroes must struggle. However, modern fantasy has increasingly embraced more complex villains who operate within shades of grey, such as George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, where characters like Cersei Lannister and Peter Baelish are driven by personal motivations that, while often destructive, are rooted in their experiences and desires. This trend reflects a broader shift in the fantasy genre towards exploring moral complexity and the humanization of villainy. In some literary works, villains are portrayed as victims of fate, suggesting that their evil actions are the result of forces beyond their control. This raises philosophical questions about free will and determinism, challenging the idea that individuals are fully responsible for their actions. In Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, for instance, Oedipus's downfall is predestined by prophecy, leading to a tragic series of events that he is powerless to prevent. While Oedipus is not a villain in the traditional sense, his story raises questions about the extent to which individuals can be held accountable for actions that are fated or predetermined. Similarly, in works like Macbeth, the role of fate and prophecy in driving the protagonist's descent into villainy complicates the notion of free will, suggesting that the boundary between villain and victim can be blurred. Conversely, some villains embrace the idea that free will is an illusion, using this belief to justify their actions. These characters often adopt a nihilistic worldview, arguing that if life has no inherent meaning or purpose, then moral constraints are meaningless. For example, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the character of Ivan Karamazov argues that if there is no God, then everything is permitted, leading to a philosophical exploration of the consequences of rejecting moral absolutes. Villains who reject free will often challenge readers to consider the implications of such a worldview, questioning whether morality can exist without the belief in choice and agency. The theme of redemption is a powerful narrative tool in literature, offering villains a path to atonement and moral recovery. The possibility of redemption adds complexity to villainous characters, suggesting that even those who commit evil deeds are not beyond hope. In Les Miserables, Victor Hugo explores this theme through the character of Jean Valjean, who, though not a villain in the traditional sense, begins his journey as a criminal and undergoes a profound moral transformation. His story highlights the power of compassion, forgiveness, and the potential for personal growth, suggesting that redemption is possible even for those who have strayed far from the path of righteousness. The theme of redemption invites readers to consider the capacity for change within all individuals, challenging the notion that anyone is irredeemably evil. Some villains actively seek redemption, driven by guilt, remorse, or a desire to atone for the past actions. This quest for redemption often becomes a central part of their character arc, providing a narrative of hope and transformation. In The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, the character of Amir, who commits a grievous moral wrong, spends much of the novel seeking redemption for his past sins. Although Amir is not a traditional villain, his actions and subsequent guilt drive the narrative, highlighting the power of redemption as a theme in literature. Villains who seek redemption often evoke empathy from readers, as they grapple with the consequences of their actions and strive to make amends. This journey towards redemption not only humanizes the villain but also emphasizes the idea that moral growth and transformation are possible, even for those who have fallen far from grace. In some narratives, villains perceive themselves as agents of justice, enacting their own form of retribution according to a personal or ideological code. These villains often believe that their actions, no matter how brutal, are justified because they are serving a greater good or correcting what they see as societal wrongs. For example, in Death Note, Light Yagami uses the Death Note to kill those he deems unworthy, believing he is creating a utopia by eliminating criminals. His actions raise questions about the morality of vigilante justice and whether the end justifies the means. These villains challenge readers to consider the fine line between justice and revenge, and the potential dangers of taking the law into one's own hands. Villains are often used to critique existing justice systems, highlighting their flaws, hypocrisies, or failings. In Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, the character of Madame Defarge is driven by a desire for vengeance against the aristocracy, which she views as a form of justice for the suffering they have caused. However, her relentless pursuit of retribution ultimately leads to her own downfall, illustrating the destructive power of vengeance and the moral complexities of justice during revolutionary times. Villains like Madame Defarge serve as a critique of how justice can be perverted by personal vendettas and societal injustices, prompting readers to reflect on the ethics of punishment and the potential for justice systems to perpetuate cycles of violence. Villains often leave a lasting impact on the world of the narrative, shaping the future long after the defeat or death. Their actions can have far-reaching consequences that affect the lives of the characters and the trajectory of the story, even after they are no longer present. In The Lord of the Rings, the shadow of Sauron looms over Middle-earth, influencing the events of the story and the decisions of the characters, even when he is not directly on the page. This lasting influence underscores the idea that evil, once unleashed, can continue to affect the world in profound ways. The legacy of villains often serves as a reminder of the enduring power of their actions and the challenges that heroes face in restoring balance and peace. Some villains inspire or create new generations of villains, perpetuating cycles of evil and conflict. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the murder of King Hamlet by his brother Claudius sets off a chain of events that leads to further betrayal, madness, and death, suggesting that one act of villainy can spawn others in its wake. This idea is also explored in Star Wars, where the legacy of Darth Vader continues to influence the galaxy long after his death, as characters struggle with the allure of the dark side. The concept of a villain's legacy emphasizes the idea that evil is not easily contained or eradicated. It can resonate across time, affecting future generations and shaping the course of history. The psychology of villains in literature is a multifaceted subject, encompassing a wide range of themes, archetypes, and philosophical questions. Villains serve as more than mere antagonists. They're essential to the narrative structure, providing the conflict necessary for the protagonist's growth and the story's development. Through their motivations, actions, and interactions with other characters, villains challenge our understanding of morality, justice, free will, and the human condition. The exploration of a villain's psyche often reveals the underlying fears, desires, and traumas that drive their actions, adding depth and complexity to their character. By examining these psychological elements, readers gain insight into the darker aspects of humanity and are prompted to question their own values and beliefs. Whether through empathy, fear, or moral reflection, villains have a profound impact on readers, shaping their experience of the narrative and their understanding of the world. Moreover, the portrayal of villains in literature reflects broader cultural and historical contexts, offering critiques of societal norms, justice systems, and the nature of power. As literature evolves, so too does the depiction of villains, with modern and postmodern works often blurring the lines between good and evil, hero and villain, challenging readers to navigate these moral ambiguities. Ultimately, the enduring fascination with villains in literature lies in their complexity and the way they mirror the struggles and contradictions inherent in the human experience. Whether they are redeemed or irredeemable, villains continue to captivate and provoke, serving as powerful reminders of the delicate balance between light and darkness within us all. The psychology of villains in literature is a rich and complex field that offers profound insights into human nature, morality, and society. Villains are not merely embodiments of evil, they are multifaceted characters who reflect the darker aspects of the human experience. Through their actions, motivations, and psychological complexities, villains challenge our understanding of good and evil, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in. As literature and media continue to evolve, so too will the portrayal of villains, ensuring that they remain a central and compelling force in storytelling. Whether they are born evil or shaped by their circumstances, villains will always captivate our imaginations, offering a mirror to our own fears, desires, and moral dilemmas.